The year was 1834. The cold air of Madrid's royal palace whispered through the darkened corridors, carrying the weight of a nation's sorrow. As the royal physician, you were no stranger to the intricacies of the human body, to the delicate art of preserving life and death. But this request was unlike any other. The king had passed, his reign marked by cruelty and paranoia, his name whispered in fear and hatred. Yet, despite his death, your task was far from over. You are summoned to the private chambers of Ferdinand II, the king who had ruled Spain with a grip so tight it nearly suffocated the kingdom. The doors to the chamber creak open, revealing the still form of the late king, draped in silk sheets. His body, once a towering figure of authority, now lay as lifeless as the power he once wielded. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, stands at the foot of the bed, her face a mask of grief and urgency. Her request, chilling in its absurdity, causes your heart to race. You are not here to mourn. You are here for something much darker, to preserve the king's anatomical legacy. Your hands tremble as you approach the bed, but it is not the king's face that draws your gaze. It is the grotesque form beneath the silk sheets, the thing that had become the defining symbol of his reign. His body, though now still, speaks of a twisted, perverse legacy, a physical anomaly that would haunt history. As you begin the preservation process, you are not merely handling a body. You are preserving the physical embodiment of Ferdinand's entire reign, oversized, bizarrely shaped, and ultimately destructive. A legacy steeped in shame, paranoia, and psychological torment. The medical records hidden away for centuries tell the story of a king plagued by his own deformity, a secret so dark that it was seldom spoken of beyond the confines of royal chambers. The Queen's voice breaks through your thoughts, her words a sharp reminder of the unimaginable burden you've been given. You are not just a physician, you are a custodian of a secret that could reshape the way history remembers this king. But this task is not just about preserving a body, it's about preserving the intimate history of a tyrant whose personal failure became a national catastrophe. Behind the walls of the palace, the corridors whisper with the tales of Ferdinand's reign, stories of failed attempts at producing an heir, of humiliation, and the psychological toll that his physical anomaly took on those closest to him. The rumors have circulated for years, but no one dared to write them down. They remain mere whispers in the shadows, too dark for the history books. And yet, here you stand, tasked with the impossible, to preserve the legacy of a man whose body was as twisted as his reign. As you work, you can't help but wonder how much of his deformity shaped the man he became. How much of his cruelty, his paranoia, his endless pursuit of control, was a direct result of the suffering he endured in silence for so many years. As you complete the grim task, you can't escape the question that lingers in the air. What if history had known? What if the truth of Ferdinand II's legacy was more than just a body on a slab, more than just whispers in the corridors of power? What if it had been revealed to the public, exposed for all to see? The thought is chilling. To understand the tragedy of Ferdinand II, you must first understand the legacy of his bloodline. A bloodline tainted by centuries of royal inbreeding, a practice that had long been a hallmark of European monarchies. But in Spain, it became a genetic curse that would leave a permanent mark on the dynasty. For generations, the Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had engaged in what could only be described as a toxic dance of marriage within the family. First cousins married each other, uncles wed nieces, and distant relatives were pulled together in the name of political alliances. This web of intermarriage created a legacy of genetic disaster, one that would manifest in the most private and painful of ways. Ferdinand II, born on the 14th of October, 1784, at the Grand El Escorial Palace, was the direct product of this royal bloodline. His parents, King Charles IV of Spain and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, were themselves first cousins, their union a political necessity rather than a personal choice. In a family where bloodlines were paramount, the physical and mental toll of such unions was ignored, sacrificed at the altar of power. As Ferdinand grew from a child to an adolescent, it became painfully clear that nature had played a cruel joke on him. His body, already burdened by the legacy of his ancestors, began to develop in ways that defied all medical understanding. His anatomy, once considered a source of royal pride, soon became the subject of ridicule, whispered gossip, and, ultimately, his greatest shame. Doctors and courtiers alike began to notice the deformity. It wasn't just his mind that had been affected by the inbreeding, it was his body anomalies so grotesque that they couldn't be ignored. His genitals began to grow in size and shape that were not only abnormal but grotesque in their proportions. The king, raised in the court of strict decorum and a society where appearances were everything, now found himself at the center of humiliating attention. As a teenager, Ferdinand's condition became a topic of quiet but persistent whispers. Foreign dignitaries who had visited the court of Spain reported the strange circumstances surrounding his physical state. Some physicians, in clinical terms, would describe his condition as a billiard cue, so distorted and disproportionate that it seemed alien to human anatomy. His shame, once hidden in the private chambers of the royal palace, became known to those who lived and worked in close proximity to him. It was a constant reminder of the family's twisted legacy, a legacy that Ferdinand would inherit in full, but could never escape. This deformity, both physically humiliating and emotionally damaging, shaped Ferdinand's view of himself and the world around him. In an era where masculinity was defined by classical ideals of strength and refinement, his body became a symbol of weakness, a living manifestation of everything that was wrong with the royal bloodline. His self-image would be forever linked to this deformity, a grotesque reminder of the powerlessness he felt, even as he was crowned king. But the ramifications of this deformity went beyond personal humiliation. It marked Ferdinand as a ruler in crisis. His royal lineage, once the pride of Spain, now stood as a dark symbol of the dangers of unchecked inbreeding. Ferdinand would spend his life fighting against the weight of his inheritance, both in the physical form of his body and in the psychological toll it took on him. The genetic curse of the Spanish Habsburgs would haunt him until his last breath, shaping his decisions, his relationships, and, ultimately, his reign. The king's deformity was not just a matter of physical form, it was a reflection of a dynasty in decay. A monarchy built on the crumbling foundation of inbreeding, Ferdinand's body became the ultimate testament to the dangers of concentrated royal power. His condition, hidden in private chambers and never discussed publicly, was a symptom of a much larger issue that plagued the Spanish royal family: the poison of generations of genetic isolation and the resulting devastation to both body and mind. The bloodline that once ruled an empire was now a source of scandal, dysfunction, and irreversible damage. And it was Ferdinand, the product of this royal curse, who would bear the weight of that legacy. As Ferdinand's body grew and matured, it became painfully apparent that nature had not only conspired against him through his bloodline, but had also left its mark in the most intimate and devastating way. His condition was unlike anything the royal physicians had seen before. In the hushed corridors of the palace, doctors whispered about the young prince's deformity, but few dared to speak of it openly. The king's most trusted physicians were the first to see the extent of Ferdinand's anomaly, and what they witnessed shocked them to their core. By the time Ferdinand entered his teenage years, the deformity had grown so severe that the medical professionals charged with his care had no choice but to address it. Detailed medical records, hidden away for centuries in the Vatican's archives, provide a chilling glimpse into the anatomical puzzle that was Ferdinand's body. One of the first physicians to document the anomaly wrote, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimate relations may prove challenging." Such a phrase, while clinical, carried with it a silent weight, an acknowledgement of a condition that could not be easily rectified. Other physicians were more blunt in their descriptions. One anonymous court doctor noted, "The prince's organ resembles nothing so much as a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at its base, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick." These written records, which have since been sealed in the most secret corners of royal archives, convey not only the horror of Ferdinand's condition, but the sense of dread that accompanied every medical consultation. His condition was not just physically damaging, it was psychologically devastating. A ruler was not only defined by his actions but by the way he was perceived, and Ferdinand's most intimate self became a constant source of shame, the root of his paranoia and fear. What struck the physicians most was not simply the grotesque size of Ferdinand's deformity, but its form. His member was not just large, it was malformed in a way that no medical text of the time could explain. The doctors speculated about the causes of his abnormality, some suggesting that it could have been a result of hormonal imbalances due to the inbreeding within the royal family. Others whispered that it was the unfortunate result of a genetic mutation, the culmination of centuries of royal intermarriage. Whatever the cause, it was clear that Ferdinand's physical state was as damaged as his legacy. The psychological effects of Ferdinand's deformity became increasingly evident as he grew older. From a young age, he had been taught that royal blood was a symbol of strength, of divine right, but his condition shattered that ideal. His body was a source of embarrassment, a grotesque distortion of what should have been a symbol of power. And so, Ferdinand withdrew deeper into himself, his sense of worth eroded by years of ridicule and scorn. The whispers in the palace were constant. Servants, who once looked at the young prince with reverence, now giggled behind their hands, their eyes full of silent mockery. Courtiers who had once been loyal now began to distance themselves, exchanging knowing glances whenever Ferdinand passed by. The foreign diplomats, who came to Spain to negotiate political alliances, couldn't help but notice the strange rumors swirling around the court, and word of Ferdinand's deformity spread to other royal houses in Europe. But it wasn't just the court that reacted to Ferdinand's condition, it was the world that saw him. To be a king was to embody the very image of masculinity and control. Yet Ferdinand was becoming the very opposite. He was a king without power, a ruler whose body betrayed him. This personal failure would shape not only Ferdinand's self-image, but his reign. His deformity became his prison, an inescapable reminder of his powerlessness that would push him into madness, cruelty, and ultimately a reign filled with paranoia and suspicion. Ferdinand's response to the mockery was not one of submission but of brutal retaliation. He developed a deep-seated resentment for those who dared to look at him as an object of ridicule. The royal physicians who had once examined him with a sense of clinical detachment now became his prisoners. Ferdinand used his power to dominate them, ensuring their silence and complete loyalty. His once trusted advisors, who had come to the palace to serve the crown, now found themselves subjected to his ever-growing cruelty. Anyone who so much as hinted at mocking him or exposing his most private failings faced the harshest of punishments. One particularly telling incident involved a young page who accidentally stumbled upon Ferdinand while he was undressing. The prince, already consumed with shame, did not merely dismiss the boy, he had him flogged and his family exiled from Madrid. The message was clear. No one would be allowed to witness the king's greatest shame and live to tell the tale. Ferdinand's cruelty became his armor, a way to shield himself from the pain of his own inadequacies. As his body continued to develop, so did the sense of isolation and hatred that began to grow within him. The king's deformity had shattered any sense of normality he might have had. His physical abnormality became the key to his psychological breakdown, and as his condition worsened, so too did his paranoia. Ferdinand's fear of ridicule and rejection grew into an all-consuming need for control. He became obsessed with preserving his dignity at all costs, no matter the emotional or physical toll it took on those around him. The court, once a symbol of grandeur and elegance, now became a breeding ground for Ferdinand's deepening insecurity. The echoes of laughter in the hallways, the whispered conversations between servants, all fed into the toxic atmosphere that surrounded him. It was no longer just a question of whether Ferdinand would produce an heir. His very existence had become a battle to maintain his royal dignity in the face of overwhelming personal failure. Ferdinand's life, from this moment onward, would be defined not by the triumphs of a ruler, but by the endless struggle to manage his greatest weakness, a weakness that would unravel his mind and the kingdom he sought to control. As Ferdinand grew into adulthood, the whispers around him only grew louder. The court, which once buzzed with excitement over the young prince's potential as Spain's future king, began to murmur behind closed doors about the king's deformity. At first, the court had been indulgent, but soon it became clear that Ferdinand's physical anomaly was not just an embarrassment, it was a source of ridicule. His body, once a symbol of royal potency, became the centerpiece of a grotesque joke that no one dared to speak of aloud, but everyone understood. The reaction of the court to Ferdinand's condition was one of quiet disdain, cloaked in the formality of royal etiquette. Courtly manners dictated that all topics deemed unbecoming be avoided, and yet the silence that enveloped Ferdinand whenever he entered a room spoke volumes. His deformity was discussed only in the hushed whispers of courtiers, behind closed doors, and exchanged looks in the hallways. Ferdinand, of course, was acutely aware of the stares, the murmurs, the subtle gestures that marked his every step. Ferdinand had been raised to believe that the Spanish monarchy was the most powerful in Europe, that his very presence was an embodiment of divine right. Yet now, he found himself the subject of laughter, a king who could not even rule over his own body. The shame of his deformity became a shadow that loomed over his every action. What should have been a source of pride, the body of a king, was instead the source of ridicule, and no matter how many layers of royal robes he donned, the mockery could not be concealed. It was a fate that no amount of royal blood could overcome. As the king became more conscious of his deformity, the paranoia grew. He began to perceive mockery where there was none, seeing even the most innocent gestures as deliberate acts of ridicule. His subjects, once loyal and respectful, now seemed like enemies in disguise. His ministers, who had once been eager to serve him, now seemed to stand just a little too far away, eyes carefully avoiding his gaze. Ferdinand's psychological breakdown was well underway. No one who crossed him, not even the closest members of his court, were safe. The paranoia became more pronounced as Ferdinand's condition worsened, affecting not only his mind but his relationship with those around him. The servants who worked in the royal palace, once honored to be in such close proximity to the king, now found themselves part of his growing delusions. Even the simplest of tasks became fraught with danger, as Ferdinand saw treachery in every corner. Servants were forced to endure his fits of anger and suspicion, while courtiers, once eager to offer their loyalty, now lived in fear of drawing the king's ire. One such incident involved the royal cook, a man who had long served the king with great care. Ferdinand had requested a special dish prepared for his supper, a simple meal, but one that required intricate preparation. When the dish was served, the king, already on edge, tasted the food only to proclaim that it had been poisoned. He immediately ordered the cook to be imprisoned and interrogated. The court was thrown into turmoil as the king's paranoia turned an everyday event into a dangerous game of suspicion. The rumors that had once been confined to the palace corridors now spread like wildfire, infecting even the most loyal subjects. The king's condition was no longer just a medical curiosity, it had become a national disgrace. Foreign diplomats who came to Spain to negotiate treaties could not help but notice the tension that simmered in the court. Whispers about the king's deformity reached beyond Madrid, spreading to the royal courts of Europe. Spain, once an empire that had dominated the world, now became the subject of mockery, its monarch reduced to an object of ridicule. The psychological toll of this relentless mockery was profound. Ferdinand, already a man haunted by his deformity, now found himself consumed by a sense of betrayal. His sense of self-worth, already fragile, crumbled under the weight of this ridicule. His reaction to mockery was not one of self-reflection, but of vindictiveness. He lashed out at those around him, trying desperately to control the world that seemed determined to expose his deepest vulnerability. But even the royal bloodline could not shield him from his growing mental instability. Ferdinand's condition became a self-fulfilling prophecy. His actions, once those of a king, became those of a man completely consumed by his fear of mockery and humiliation. The court, once a place of grandeur and diplomacy, now became a breeding ground for distrust and fear. Ferdinand's paranoia bled into every corner of the palace, corrupting everything he touched. The courtiers who once adored him now found themselves walking on eggshells, fearful of making a wrong move. Servants, who had long been the unseen backbone of the royal household, were now tasked with the impossible: to serve a man who could not trust anyone. Ferdinand's reign, which had once seemed destined to restore Spain to its former glory, was unraveling, not due to external enemies, but because of the invisible enemy within. His own mind, distorted by shame and paranoia. His deformity, once a secret whispered in the dark corners of the royal court, had become the defining feature of his rule. No longer was he Ferdinand, the King of Spain. He was Ferdinand, the man whose body had betrayed him, whose shame had consumed him, and whose reign would be remembered not for its power, but for its tragedy. Ferdinand's obsession with his physical anomaly soon became inseparable from his desperation to produce a male heir. His kingdom, teetering on the brink of decline, desperately needed a successor, someone to carry on his bloodline, even if that bloodline was already stained by years of inbreeding. His deformity, however, stood as the ultimate barrier to this dream. The king's obsession with fertility began when he realized that his deformity was not just a source of personal shame, it was a barrier to the one thing he yearned for most: a son. In an era where royal legitimacy and the continuation of the bloodline were paramount, the inability to produce an heir was more than a personal failure, it was a royal catastrophe. Every attempt to restore the royal line felt like a desperate attempt to salvage his legacy. But Ferdinand's physical condition, far beyond the normal complications of royal marriage, made conception all but impossible. The royal physicians, already aware of Ferdinand's deformity, were thrust into the impossible task of providing solutions for a problem that had no simple answer. They were not dealing with an ordinary medical condition. They were faced with the challenge of managing the king's sexual dysfunction, a grotesque anomaly that could not be addressed by traditional methods. The physicians, bound by their duty, sought out every possible solution, from ancient remedies to newly discovered potions, all in the hope of restoring Ferdinand's potency. Ferdinand turned to the court's alchemists, foreign doctors, and even mystics, all promising remedies that could normalize his body, if not make it completely functional. Some remedies were outrageous, claiming to shrink the king's deformity to more manageable proportions. Others, like potions crafted from rare herbs, rhinoceros, horn, and powdered pearls, were said to enhance his fertility despite the deformity. The king, desperate and increasingly paranoid, spared no expense in acquiring these quack treatments, but each one proved as ineffective as the last. The desperation reached new heights when Ferdinand began consulting foreign specialists, doctors, and surgeons who were brought into Spain with the hope that their advanced knowledge might offer something the royal physicians had missed. Yet, like the others, they too failed to offer a solution. The treatments ranged from bizarre concoctions of animal parts and exotic herbs to nonsensical rituals, all of which provided nothing more than false hope. Ferdinand's condition, both physical and psychological, worsened. He became increasingly obsessed with the idea of restoration not just for himself but for Spain. His kingship, already marked by the shadow of his deformity, was now threatened by the very possibility of an heirless reign. Each failed attempt at conception was a blow to his dignity, a reminder that his greatest enemy was not an external one, but his own body. The king, once a young man with potential, was now reduced to a figure whose reign was defined not by his political power, but by his sexual failure. The palace, once alive with political discussions and royal duties, became a place of constant medical consultations. Ferdinand's every waking moment was consumed by thoughts of fertility. His obsession with producing an heir dominated all aspects of royal life. Meetings with foreign diplomats were delayed, cabinet meetings postponed, and even Spain's military campaigns put on hold, all for the sake of a child who seemed increasingly impossible to produce. His first marriage to Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily was a case in point. The union, which had begun with the hope of strengthening political ties, quickly descended into a nightmare. The wedding night, a moment that should have been filled with the promise of new beginnings, became the scene of a medical procedure rather than a romantic union. The specially designed marital aids, cushions, oils, and ointments were brought into the royal bedchamber, the preparations for which could have been mistaken for a surgical operation rather than a marriage celebration. Maria Antonia, innocent and unaware, was horrified by the sight of her new husband, whose deformity now lay before her like a grotesque monument to his failed masculinity. The encounter was not just physically traumatic for Maria Antonia, it was emotionally devastating for both. The process, which should have been an intimate and loving experience, turned into a clinical affair where Ferdinand's deformity, rather than his love, was the focus. He needed his wife to comply with a procedure that was as much about medicine as it was about fertility. Ferdinand's desperation took its toll on Maria Antonia, whose health began to deteriorate in the face of this constant psychological and physical trauma. The Queen's emotional breakdown came quickly, as her new life as a royal bride was overshadowed by her husband's demands. Ferdinand, meanwhile, grew increasingly convinced that his wife's emotional distress was the sole cause of their failure to conceive. His obsession with producing an heir only intensified, but instead of compassion, he displayed an increasing cruelty. His accusations of Maria Antonia's failure to fulfill her wifely duties were as relentless as they were unfounded. Court records and memoirs from that time describe the endless cycle that ensued. Ferdinand would summon his physicians to prepare the royal bedchamber, and Maria Antonia, overwhelmed by her own terror and growing addiction to the sedative laudanum, would endure the ordeal. There was no love in this process, only clinical precision. It was a ritualized nightmare for both parties, one that repeated itself with agonizing regularity. Ferdinand's body, once a symbol of royal potency, had become the greatest obstacle to his legacy. In his desperation, Ferdinand turned to even more extreme measures. He began experimenting with bizarre restraints and devices, believing that if he could just correct the process, he could finally produce an heir. These custom-made restraints, designed to hold Maria Antonia in place, were crafted by the same artisans who made the king's saddles and hunting equipment. The leather and silk contraptions were intended to prevent Maria Antonia from pulling away, as she had done in her sheer terror during their earlier encounters. The palace, once a place of beauty and grandeur, had now become a laboratory for Ferdinand's sexual dysfunction, a place where his personal humiliation overshadowed every royal function. It was not just the failure to produce an heir that consumed Ferdinand. It was his increasing belief that the problem lay entirely with his wife. His fixation on her perceived failure drove him into further paranoia, making each attempt at conception feel more like a power struggle than a natural process. His court, once a seat of political power, now served as a testing ground for bizarre remedies, strange devices, and psychological warfare, all in the name of a royal bloodline that seemed increasingly impossible to continue. Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir had transformed his reign into a farce, with every attempt to restore his royal dignity only highlighting the depth of his dysfunction. His failure to recognize the true nature of his deformity, both physical and psychological, would come to define his reign. Spain, once a proud empire, was now the kingdom of a king obsessed with one thing: fertility. It was a quest that would ultimately drive him into madness, leaving behind a legacy defined not by his political achievements but by the desperate, tragic pursuit of a future he could never secure. Ferdinand's first marriage was meant to be a union of political necessity, an alliance designed to secure Spain's place on the European stage. But for Ferdinand, it became something far darker, a living nightmare that he and his young bride, Maria Antonia, could never have anticipated. Their wedding was an event of grand spectacle, filled with the pageantry and ritual that accompanies royal marriages. The people of Madrid gathered in the streets to witness the union of their future king, a prince who had long been groomed for power, and his bride, a princess of Naples, whose own family was eager to secure its place in Spain's royal court. Maria Antonia, only a teenager when she arrived at the Spanish court, had heard tales of her future husband. She had heard of his reputation. He was charming, the desired one in the eyes of his supporters, but she had been kept in the dark about the more disturbing aspects of the king's condition. In the naive and innocent way that most royal brides of the time were, she imagined her marriage to be one of love and duty, a union that would help her grow into the role of queen. But nothing in her sheltered life had prepared her for the horror that awaited her on their wedding night. The moment she entered the royal bedchamber, her eyes widened in shock, and a scream tore through the air. The ladies in waiting, who had been instructed to prepare the room with the necessary equipment, exchanged nervous glances. Ferdinand, his mind already consumed with fear and paranoia about his condition, had insisted on the use of special cushions, oils, and tools designed to facilitate intimacy despite the deformity that marred his body. But when Maria Antonia saw her new husband, it wasn't the man she had imagined. What she saw was a grotesque and terrifying physical anomaly, one that her mind could not process. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. In her terror, she backed away from the bed, screaming, "Monster! Monster!" until she collapsed against the wall, pointing in horror at Ferdinand's deformed body. The king, accustomed to the whispers and mockery that had followed him throughout his life, did not react with anger or shame, but with a frantic sense of desperation. He had already seen his deformity through the eyes of others, but seeing it through his bride's eyes, the eyes of someone who had no prior knowledge of his condition, brought the depth of his humiliation to an unbearable level. Ferdinand's first instinct was not to comfort his bride, but to ensure that their marriage proceeded according to royal protocol, no matter the cost. The specially designed marital aids were brought in cushions and supports designed to hold him in place during the act. His physicians, who had been standing by in anticipation of the evening's events, were immediately called to assist, further stripping the moment of any semblance of romance or tenderness. For Ferdinand, this was not a night of passion but a medical procedure, a process that had to be endured in the name of royal duty. Maria Antonia, her innocence shattered, was not prepared for the clinical nature of their union. She was young, uneducated in the realities of royal marriages, and had expected a night of celebration, not one marked by trauma. Her terror was not merely physical, it was psychological, and the effects were immediate. The act, which should have been a natural part of their union, became a gruesome spectacle, one that left her in hysterics. Her ladies-in-waiting, who had been instructed in the royal expectations, could only watch as their queen broke down, the shock overwhelming her mind and body. As soon as the ordeal was over, Maria Antonia was given a strong sedative, and the process was repeated in the days to follow. Ferdinand, consumed by his desperation to produce an heir, continued to push her, forcing the same clinical procedures to unfold again and again. But what was supposed to be a private, intimate experience became a painful reminder of his body's failure. The physical and psychological toll on Maria Antonia was immense. She grew ill, both physically and mentally, as her body became increasingly resistant to the demands placed on it. The trauma of these encounters began to take its toll on her health, and she became addicted to the sedative Lardin, which helped her endure the physical and emotional strain. The palace became a place of constant medical intervention, where the process of producing an heir was treated as a sterile, clinical exercise, rather than a natural union between husband and wife. Every day felt like a repetition of the last. Ferdinand's physicians worked tirelessly to monitor his wife's condition, adjusting the process and the equipment, trying in vain to make conception a reality. But despite their efforts, no pregnancy followed. Each failed attempt was a devastating blow to Ferdinand's ego, and each failure turned his obsession into something far darker. Maria Antonia, once a lively young princess, was slowly deteriorating. Her nights were filled with nightmares, and her health declined as the physical trauma of their intimate encounters wore her down. Her psychological state, once stable, began to unravel. The young queen was becoming a shadow of the woman she had been, her mind trapped in the same web of humiliation and terror that had ensnared Ferdinand. She was a pawn in his desperate quest to produce an heir, and yet the pressure only seemed to make things worse. The court, once a place of ceremonial importance and political discourse, had become a battleground, a place where Ferdinand's paranoia, cruelty, and desperation reigned. No one was allowed to question the king's actions, and the queens who entered his life were doomed to endure the same fate. Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir overshadowed everything else. He could not see beyond his own need to restore his royal bloodline, even at the cost of his own marriage and the well-being of those closest to him. For Maria Antonia, the toll was unbearable. The once bright and hopeful princess had become a broken woman, her health and sanity destroyed by the monstrous demands of her husband. She never fully recovered from the trauma, and her life, which had begun with such promise, came to a tragic end. In 1807, after years of suffering, Maria Antonia died at the age of just 21. Officially, her death was attributed to fever and complications from her delicate constitution, but the truth was far darker. She had died of despair, her body and mind destroyed by the relentless psychological and physical abuse she had endured at the hands of Ferdinand. Ferdinand's response to her death was telling. He showed little grief, only a sense of frustrated resignation. In the wake of Maria Antonia's passing, rumors spread that Ferdinand, in his desperation, had poisoned her, convinced that her failure to produce an heir had been a personal betrayal. The death of the palace apothecary, just days after Maria Antonia's passing, further fueled these rumors, suggesting that something far more sinister had been at play. But the king, ever paranoid, focused only on his next move, finding another wife who could bear him a son. The death of Maria Antonia marked the end of the first tragic chapter in Ferdinand's life, but it was only the beginning of a much darker tale, one that would see him plunge even deeper into madness, cruelty, and despair. The death of Maria Antonia, though officially listed as a natural consequence of her fragile constitution, cast a long shadow over Ferdinand's reign. The tragedy of his first wife's passing, combined with his unrelenting obsession with producing an heir, pushed Ferdinand into deeper realms of paranoia. The king's mind, already distorted by his physical abnormality and years of psychological torment, began to warp further, and with the death of Maria Antonia, he found himself consumed by accusations that would forever taint his relationship with his wives. Ferdinand's grief was not what one would expect from a grieving husband. His reaction was not one of sorrow but of suspicion, a deep and growing belief that his wife had somehow sabotaged his efforts to produce an heir. His obsession with infertility spiraled into a dark and twisted conviction that Maria Antonia had intentionally withheld the child he so desperately needed. His paranoia was fed by every failed attempt, every month that passed without a pregnancy, and the increasingly traumatic process they had endured in the royal bedchamber. Ferdinand, unable to acknowledge the true nature of his condition, twisted his perception of events, blaming his wife for their lack of success. He convinced himself that she had deliberately tried to prevent conception, a thought that only deepened his paranoia. It became an obsession, one that consumed him entirely. He believed that her physical resistance to the marital acts, fueled by fear and disgust, was a deliberate attempt to undermine his royal bloodline. This unfounded accusation marked the beginning of a new chapter in Ferdinand's reign, a chapter defined by increasingly erratic and cruel behavior. In his mind, Maria Antonia's failure to bear him an heir was not just a personal failure, it was an act of treason. Ferdinand began to accuse her of deliberately preventing the conception of a son, as though her body were betraying him. He convinced himself that she had either taken some form of poison to prevent pregnancy, or was simply refusing to comply with the demands of royal duty. He saw her refusal to engage in the process with the same sense of dread and revulsion that had plagued her for years, as an affront to his kingship and a rejection of his authority. Ferdinand's accusations went beyond the privacy of their royal chambers and began to poison the atmosphere of the court. His suspicions bled into every aspect of palace life, from the servants who attended to Maria Antonia to the physicians who had been present during their attempts at procreation. The court became a hotbed of fear and distrust, where no one was safe from Ferdinand's scrutiny. Those who were closest to Maria Antonia found themselves caught in the king's web of suspicion. The queen's ladies-in-waiting, who had once been trusted companions, were now treated as spies, their every move watched, and their words examined for signs of conspiracy. Ferdinand's cruelty grew more pronounced. He had his wife's ladies-in-waiting watched closely, questioning their loyalty, and occasionally having them subjected to humiliating interrogations. The Queen's physicians, once highly regarded men of science, were now viewed with suspicion. Ferdinand's accusations against Maria Antonia became so entrenched that he dismissed any explanation that did not fit his paranoid view of events. Instead of looking at his own condition, the deformity that rendered normal intimacy impossible, he blamed his wife, who had endured far more trauma than any woman should have in her marriage. Maria Antonia, already shattered by years of physical and emotional abuse, was now forced to endure even more. Her psychological state deteriorated rapidly under the constant scrutiny and accusations from her husband. She became withdrawn, increasingly unable to shield herself from the mental and physical toll the royal marriage had taken on her. The woman who had once entered Spain with hope and innocence now found herself in the depths of despair. Her health, both physical and mental, was on a steady decline, and the relentless pressure of Ferdinand's demands pushed her closer to the edge. Despite Ferdinand's relentless pursuit of an heir, his failure to acknowledge the true cause of his condition, the deformity that had plagued him since his youth, prevented any possibility of healing. The king's refusal to face reality, his insistence on projecting blame onto others, and his complete disregard for his wife's suffering only further drove a wedge between them. Ferdinand's paranoia had reached a point where he could no longer see his wife as a person, but as an obstacle to his own royal destiny. Maria Antonia's emotional and psychological collapse became inevitable. Her attempts to endure the torturous routine of the royal bedchamber had left her exhausted, both physically and mentally. The drug-induced stupor of laudanum, meant to help her cope with the trauma of the royal marriage, had now become a necessity for survival. But it was not just the drugs that were destroying her, it was the constant psychological torment. Ferdinand's accusations, his refusal to accept the reality of their situation, and the ever-present threat of further punishment wore away at her fragile state. Eventually, Maria Antonia's health failed to the point where her body could no longer withstand the stress. Her death, while officially attributed to fever and complications from her delicate constitution, was the tragic culmination of a life spent under Ferdinand's cruel expectations. Her passing marked not only the end of a young woman's life, but also the failure of Ferdinand's first attempt at marriage and his first chance to restore the royal bloodline. Ferdinand's reaction to her death was devoid of the grief one might expect from a husband. Instead, he seemed almost relieved his first wife had failed him, and now he could begin the search for a new bride who could meet his demands. But even in death, Maria Antonia would not be allowed peace. Ferdinand's mind, twisted by his insecurities, began to entertain the idea that she had been poisoned, further fueling the rumors of foul play. He had no compassion for her suffering, only a desire to move forward, to find someone who could give him the heir that his bloodline so desperately needed. In the wake of Maria Antonia's death, the royal court became even more tense. Ferdinand's paranoia reached new heights, and his view of the world became even more distorted. He had already lost one wife, and now he was determined to find another who could bear him a son. The search for a second wife began, but this time, it was clear that Ferdinand would not make the same mistakes. His next bride would have to endure more than just the demands of a royal marriage. She would have to endure Ferdinand's obsessions, his cruelty, and his ever-growing paranoia. Ferdinand's first marriage had been a tragedy of epic proportions. It had not only destroyed Maria Antonia, but had also set the stage for a reign defined by dysfunction, cruelty, and relentless pursuit of a legacy that seemed destined to elude him. The scars left by this marriage would stay with him for the rest of his life, and his second marriage would only deepen the wounds he had already inflicted on his soul. The death of Maria Antonia did little to calm Ferdinand's fears or satisfy his obsessive quest for a male heir. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one marked by a renewed, even more desperate, search for a woman who could provide him with what he craved most: a son. His second marriage, to Maria Isabel of Portugal, was once again a political arrangement. Ferdinand, already scarred by his first failed union, entered this marriage with even greater expectations and insecurities. Maria Isabel, much like Maria Antonia before her, was a young woman thrust into a foreign court under the weight of royal expectations. At just 19 years old, she arrived at the Spanish court full of hope and idealism, imagining herself to be entering a fairy tale marriage. What she didn't know was that her new husband's mind was far from the image of the loving, attentive king she had been led to expect. Ferdinand's psychological deterioration, his obsession with producing an heir, and his deeply ingrained paranoia had already shaped him into someone entirely unrecognizable from the prince she had dreamed of marrying. The marriage ceremony itself, although grand in spectacle, was overshadowed by Ferdinand's increasing anxiety and obsession with the royal duty he could never seem to fulfill. The moment Maria Isabel entered the royal bedchamber, she was confronted with the same medical procedures and grotesque customs that had marked Ferdinand's first wedding night. The special cushions, oils, and other devices necessary to make intimacy even remotely possible were brought into the room. But this time, it wasn't just the physical discomfort that would mark their union. The psychological weight of Ferdinand's past failures, his inability to face the reality of his condition, and his growing distrust of everyone around him cast a long, dark shadow over the marriage. Maria Isabel, who had been briefed by her ladies-in-waiting about the peculiarities of the royal wedding night, was prepared for some oddities. But nothing could have prepared her for the grotesque reality of Ferdinand's deformity. Once again, the royal bedchamber was not a place of tenderness, but a clinical setting. Ferdinand, though outwardly polite, was consumed by his internal fears and insecurities, and he expected nothing less than total compliance. His desperation grew with each passing day, and with it, his cruelty. The strain of Ferdinand's demands and psychological instability soon began to weigh heavily on Maria Isabel. She had hoped to be a beloved queen, but she found herself trapped in a marriage that was more akin to an experiment than a romantic union. Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir became a brutal ritual, one in which his wife's suffering was but a small price to pay. The emotional and physical toll on Maria Isabel grew as the months wore on. The trauma of their failed attempts at conception, coupled with Ferdinand's accusations of inadequacy and her increasing sense of entrapment, led her down a path of deepening distress. The most telling aspect of their second marriage was not just the failed attempts at intimacy, but Ferdinand's increasingly erratic behavior. His paranoia, which had already been a defining characteristic of his reign, now began to seep into every aspect of his relationship with Maria Isabel. His accusations grew more outlandish and more frequent. He began to suspect that she was withholding affection, that she was sabotaging their efforts to produce an heir. But rather than seeing the situation for what it truly was, his physical condition, Ferdinand twisted the narrative, believing that Maria Isabel's supposed rejection of him was intentional. Ferdinand's growing obsession with secrecy and surveillance became a hallmark of his second marriage. He began to monitor his wife's every movement, convinced that even her smallest actions were part of a larger conspiracy to deny him an heir. His paranoia led to increasingly bizarre measures, including spying on Maria Isabel during her most private moments. The walls of the royal palace, once a place of grandeur and power, now became a cage. Ferdinand's obsession with control extended to every aspect of his wife's life. Her letters were read, her servants were interrogated, and her every action scrutinized. Despite the pressure, Maria Isabel continued to endure. She learned to mask her emotions, to keep up appearances in public, but behind the scenes, the strain of living under Ferdinand's rule was taking its toll. She developed a pronounced stutter, a nervous habit that would never leave her. The court physicians, who had already witnessed the king's bizarre rituals, now began to observe Maria Isabel's increasing frailty. Her mental health deteriorated as she became trapped in a psychological spiral, one where she could never escape the scrutiny of her husband's eyes. Her screams, once unheard in the silence of the night, now echoed through the halls of the palace, a constant reminder of the deep psychological toll the marriage was taking on her. Ferdinand, unable to see the pain he was inflicting, grew more convinced that his wife was conspiring against him, that her terror and distress were merely a ploy to avoid fulfilling her royal duties. The psychological abuse, which had started with Ferdinand's accusations and paranoia, now became more overt. He began to isolate Maria Isabel, preventing her from speaking freely with her ladies-in-waiting, and subjecting her to even more medical procedures designed to correct the failures of their marriage. The power dynamics in the palace shifted, with Ferdinand at the center of a web of fear and control. His increasing cruelty and psychological torment of his wife were a clear indication of his unraveling mind. What had begun as a union of political convenience had descended into a realm of psychological terror, one in which Maria Isabel was left to endure her husband's irrational demands and expectations. The king's mental state continued to deteriorate, and his obsession with producing an heir became an even darker obsession. At the same time, Maria Isabel's health and spirits continued to worsen. She was not merely physically exhausted from the repeated attempts at conception, but emotionally drained by the constant pressure, humiliation, and torment inflicted by Ferdinand. Her suffering, once hidden behind the mask of royal decorum, began to show. She grew thinner, weaker, more withdrawn, and the court watched with growing concern. Yet, even in her suffering, she knew that her position as queen was one she could not abandon. Her role was to provide Spain with a legitimate heir, and Ferdinand's cruelty was not something she could escape. But fate, as always, had its own plans. Maria Isabel's fragile body, unable to bear the strain of the royal marriage, succumbed to the pressure. The death of his second wife, just as tragic as the first, came as no surprise to the court, but it did little to ease Ferdinand's suffering. Once again, he found himself in the same painful position, alone and without an heir. His reaction to her death was one of confusion and bitterness, as he spiraled further into his delusions and paranoia. His second marriage, like his first, had been a failure, and the cycle of suffering, suspicion, and dysfunction would continue, as Ferdinand's obsessive search for a solution to his royal dilemma spiraled ever downward. Ferdinand's second marriage, though equally tragic, had not been his final attempt to secure an heir. The Spanish monarchy, desperate to restore the royal bloodline and halt the slow collapse of Ferdinand's reign, arranged for a third marriage, this time to Maria Joseph of Saxony. At 24 years old, Maria Joseph was a more mature and worldly woman than either of Ferdinand's previous wives. She had received detailed briefings from her advisors, who had prepared her for the strange and difficult nature of her royal duty. By now, the rumors about Ferdinand's deformity had spread throughout the European courts, and Maria Joseph was no stranger to them. Still, she entered the marriage with the hope that her union with the king could somehow restore the dignity of the Spanish crown. Unlike his first two marriages, Ferdinand's approach to this union was more clinical than romantic. His obsession with producing an heir, particularly a male heir, now reached its most extreme form. Maria Joseph, well aware of Ferdinand's condition and the desperation driving him, was not naive. She approached the marriage with the mindset of a scientist, treating it as a challenge to be solved, rather than a natural part of married life. She had brought with her not only a sense of duty, but also a collection of medical devices and preparations, hoping that the latest innovations in royal medicine might offer a solution to the king's increasingly bizarre demands. The royal bedchamber became a veritable laboratory for medical experimentation. Ferdinand's previous wives had endured a battery of medical devices, specialized cushions, and carefully timed rituals designed to make intercourse possible. But Maria Joseph's approach was different. She treated their intimacy like a procedure, one that could be analyzed, adjusted, and perfected. Despite her clinical detachment, however, the psychological toll of these repeated, sterile encounters began to wear on her as well. Ferdinand's mind was increasingly consumed with his own failures, and his desperation grew. He became more obsessive, his belief that Maria Joseph could somehow provide him with an heir edging into madness. Every attempt was framed as a medical intervention. The king consulted with foreign experts, renowned anatomists, and even some from more dubious backgrounds who claimed to have special knowledge of difficult cases like his. Ferdinand, desperate to find a solution, welcomed them all into his court. The royal bedchamber, once a symbol of marriage and intimacy, had now become a disturbing arena for experimentation, as every aspect of their relationship was scrutinized, adjusted, and controlled. The toll on Maria Joseph was profound, but different from that of his previous wives. Where Maria Antonia and Maria Isabel had suffered physically and emotionally, Maria Joseph's suffering was more intellectual. She became trapped in the ritual of it all. She meticulously kept records of every attempt, noting the time, position, and results of each effort. She documented everything with the precision of a research scientist, but in doing so, she began to lose her sense of self. The woman who had arrived at the Spanish court with hope and purpose was now becoming a shadow of her former self. Every part of her life was consumed by the king's obsession, and she could not escape. As the months passed, Ferdinand's efforts to produce an heir became increasingly bizarre. He began to view Maria Joseph not as a wife, but as a vessel, a tool to fulfill his royal duty. His obsession with their attempts at conception bordered on the grotesque. He demanded that their encounters be timed according to astrology, consulting astronomers and mystics who promised that the stars would align in his favor. He became convinced that the failure to produce an heir was not only a personal failing but a cosmic conspiracy, one that could only be solved through rituals and prayers. The palace became a place of strange ceremonies, incense burning, and chants that filled the royal chambers with a sense of unease. Despite all the medical interventions, the devices, the rituals, and the incantations, Maria Joseph could not conceive. Each failure led to greater distress. Ferdinand's mental state continued to deteriorate, and his reactions became more erratic. His suspicions of conspiracy, which had plagued his earlier marriages, now spread to his third wife. He became convinced that Maria Joseph, despite all the efforts they had undertaken together, was sabotaging their attempts to conceive. The accusations began to escalate. He believed she was secretly working against him, conspiring with foreign powers to ruin his chances of securing the royal bloodline. As Ferdinand grew more paranoid, his cruelty toward Maria Joseph also escalated. He became less concerned with her well-being and more focused on forcing the results he demanded. He consulted increasingly obscure sources, trying to find any scrap of advice that might unlock the secret to producing an heir. But all his efforts were in vain. Each failed pregnancy, each missed opportunity to create the royal heir, only deepened his frustration and anxiety. Maria Joseph, meanwhile, was isolated. While Ferdinand's obsession grew, so too did the loneliness that she felt in her royal duties. The court, once filled with the spectacle and grandeur of royal life, now seemed cold and distant. She could no longer speak freely with her ladies-in-waiting. She could no longer express the emotional toll her marriage was taking on her. Even her closest confidants had begun to withdraw, fearing Ferdinand's growing temper and unpredictable outbursts. The toll of this unending cycle of medical procedures, mistrust, and alienation eventually took its most tragic turn. Maria Joseph's health began to deteriorate, but not in the way it had for his previous wives. She did not fall ill from physical trauma, but from the emotional weight of an impossible situation. She became withdrawn, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and despair. Her once vibrant spirit was crushed under the constant pressure, and the repeated failures to produce an heir left her feeling like a prisoner in her own marriage. Ferdinand, oblivious to the emotional toll his actions had taken, was focused only on one thing: his legacy. His mind had become a prison of obsession, and no amount of medical intervention or mystical cure could release him from his torment. The physical condition that had caused his suffering from childhood had now consumed his entire life, leaving him with little regard for the people who were forced to live with him. Maria Joseph, despite her best efforts, could not break the cycle. The end of their marriage came not with the birth of an heir, but with the collapse of Ferdinand's mental state. His inability to produce a son and his increasing delusions pushed him further into madness. Maria Joseph's condition continued to worsen, and eventually her health failed her completely. The trauma of the marriage, the constant pressure, and the failure to meet Ferdinand's demands had left her emotionally and physically exhausted. She passed away, another casualty of Ferdinand's quest to fulfill a royal duty that, in the end, was impossible. Ferdinand, once again without an heir and with another wife lost to his obsession, found himself at a crossroads. His third marriage, much like the first two, had failed in the most tragic of ways. And yet, despite all his failures, Ferdinand remained unbroken. He would search again, desperate to find someone who could bear him the heir he so desperately needed. The cycle of misery, desperation, and psychological torment that had marked Ferdinand's first two marriages would continue, and the monarchy of Spain would remain in turmoil as a king, consumed by his own deformity, searched for solutions that could never come. His reign, and the legacy of his bloodline, would ultimately be defined not by his accomplishments, but by the unrelenting failures that haunted his every step. By the time Ferdinand entered the final years of his reign, Spain had become a shell of its former self. The once vibrant kingdom, a powerful empire that had stretched across the Americas and Europe, was now on the verge of collapse. Ferdinand's obsessive search for an heir had not only consumed his personal life but had also led to the decline of his political authority. The empire was weakening, its colonies in revolt, its finances in ruin, and yet Ferdinand remained fixated on his most personal failure. The king's physical health, always a point of contention, had deteriorated steadily over the years. His doctors, once hopeful that he might somehow overcome his deformity, now simply tried to manage his ongoing pain and discomfort. Chronic gout ravaged his joints, leaving him hunched and bedridden for long periods. The pain from his condition, coupled with the weight of his years of paranoia and trauma, caused his once commanding presence to wither. His mental state, too, had begun to fray beyond repair. The delusions that had characterized his reign only deepened in his later years. Ferdinand, ever obsessed with maintaining the facade of strength, continued his cruel manipulation of those around him. His reign had become increasingly erratic, marked by irrational decisions, violent outbursts, and moments of deep despair. The kingdom he had once ruled with iron-fisted authority was now crippled by his psychological instability. Ministers who had served him loyally for decades began to question his sanity, but no one dared challenge him openly. Ferdinand had become a tyrant not only in politics but in the lives of those closest to him. His paranoia had infected his entire court, leaving it fractured and unstable. While Ferdinand's reign descended into madness, Spain's international standing began to crumble. Ferdinand's obsession with securing an heir had consumed so much of his attention that he failed to address the pressing issues of his kingdom. Spain's American colonies, once vital sources of wealth, had begun to revolt, seeking independence from a monarch whose grip on the empire was weakening. As revolutionary movements gained momentum in the Americas, Ferdinand's focus remained entirely inward, obsessed with his own failures rather than the needs of his people. His failure to provide a legitimate heir became a rallying cry for Spain's enemies, both at home and abroad. Ferdinand had become a symbol not only of personal failure, but of national decline. Despite the turmoil within his court and the growing unrest in Spain, Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir never ceased. His mind, now consumed by paranoia and fear, saw betrayal everywhere. He demanded endless investigations into his courtiers, believing that conspiracies were being woven against him at every turn. His spies reported to him about the slightest transgression, the faintest hint of disloyalty. His palace had become a prison of suspicion, and even his most trusted advisors were not safe from his wrath. In his final years, Ferdinand's paranoia reached its peak. He suspected even his own family members of plotting against him. His relationship with his daughter, Isabella II, was fraught with tension. Ferdinand, who had longed for an heir throughout his life, now found himself consumed with doubts about her legitimacy. He knew the truth that Isabella was not his biological daughter, and yet he was compelled to maintain the fiction that she was the rightful heir to the throne. His obsession with proving her legitimacy was all-consuming. He employed genealogists, physicians, and even astrologers to find any evidence that would support his belief that Isabella was indeed his daughter. Despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, his behavior became more erratic as his physical condition worsened. He ordered the construction of secret passages in his palace, obsessed with avoiding assassination attempts that he believed were imminent. He kept a network of spies to monitor the movements of everyone around him, even his own family. The once powerful king had become a paranoid, isolated figure, unable to see the reality of his situation. Ferdinand's final years were marked by a profound sense of self-delusion. His obsession with restoring his dynasty and proving his worth as a monarch led him to believe that somehow, some way, he would be able to overcome the failures of his past. But the truth was inescapable. His physical deformity had been the root of his downfall, and his inability to acknowledge or accept it had left him a prisoner of his own mind. His obsession had rendered him incapable of fulfilling his duties as a ruler, leaving Spain in a state of perpetual crisis. Finally, in 1833, after decades of political failure, personal torment, and unrelenting paranoia, Ferdinand died. Officially, the cause of death was gout, a fitting end for a man whose body had long betrayed him. But those who had been closest to him knew the truth. Ferdinand had died not from a physical ailment, but from a lifetime of psychological damage. His mind had broken under the weight of his obsession, and his reign had crumbled in the wake of his personal dysfunction. The aftermath of Ferdinand's death was immediate and profound. Spain, already in disarray, faced a new era of uncertainty. His daughter, Isabella II, was crowned queen, but the legitimacy of her rule was questioned by many, especially in the wake of Ferdinand's suspicions about her paternity. The Spanish court, fractured by Ferdinand's paranoia and cruelty, was now left to pick up the pieces of a kingdom that had been left broken by its former ruler. Ferdinand's legacy, if it can be called that, was one of tragedy. He is remembered not as a king who restored Spain to its former glory, but as a man whose personal dysfunction destroyed not only his family, but his kingdom. His reign serves as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked power and the catastrophic consequences of personal dysfunction becoming inextricably linked to political authority. In the end, Ferdinand's most enduring legacy was not the empire he ruled, but the suffering he caused the wives who died in his service, the people who lived in fear under his tyrannical rule, and the kingdom that fractured under the weight of his obsession. The royal physician, who had once been tasked with preserving Ferdinand's anatomical legacy, must have felt the full irony of his work. The king, whose body had become his greatest enemy, had left behind a legacy not of strength, but of personal and political collapse. Ferdinand II's death marked the end of an era, but his personal tragedies lived on, haunting Spain for generations to come. His story remains a powerful reminder of how a king's most intimate failings can resonate through history, shaping the destiny of not just a nation, but the very lives of those caught in his wake. As Ferdinand's reign wore on, it became evident that the man at the helm of Spain was rapidly deteriorating, both physically and psychologically. What began as the personal affliction of a single monarch had now intertwined with the very fate of his empire. The once thriving Spanish Empire, built on the strength of its colonies and global influence, was in freefall. Ferdinand's personal failures, magnified by his physical deformities and psychology, Ferdinand, who had once been hailed as a strong leader, had become a political liability. His inability to recognize his own weaknesses and his relentless pursuit of a male heir had drained Spain of its resources, both human and financial. The monarch's focus was on matters of the flesh, his health, his virility, and his legacy, while his kingdom burned. Spain's colonies, particularly in South America, had begun to rebel in earnest, seeking independence from a monarch who seemed oblivious to their plight. As revolutions spread throughout the Americas, Ferdinand's focus on his personal issues. At home, his reign had become a comedy of errors. Ferdinand's paranoia grew with each passing year. He was convinced that foreign powers were conspiring against him, and that his political rivals were plotting to overthrow him. This led to more extreme measures: constant surveillance of his court, widespread purges, and an ever-tightening grip on power. But the more he tried to control his environment, the more his paranoia eroded the very foundations of his rule. Internationally, Ferdinand became a laughingstock. Foreign diplomats, who once viewed him as a powerful monarch, now saw him as a pathetic, broken man. His obsession with his physical deformities and his inability to govern effectively became the subject of mockery in European courts. Spain's former allies began to distance themselves, recognizing that Ferdinand's mental and physical decline made Spain an unreliable partner. Meanwhile, revolutionary movements were gaining ground in Spain's colonies, where they saw Ferdinand's incapacity as a symbol of a crumbling empire. The internal disintegration of Spain mirrored the breakdown of Ferdinand's psyche. The political instability that plagued his reign led to a weakening of Spain's position on the world stage. Ferdinand's failure to address the needs of his country, his inability to focus on anything beyond his personal insecurities, left Spain vulnerable. The king, once a symbol of strength and authority, had become a shadow of his former self, unable to control the very empire he was supposed to protect. As the Spanish Empire faltered, Ferdinand's grip on power loosened. The revolts in the Americas were not only fueled by a desire for independence but by the perception that Ferdinand's rule was weak and ineffectual. Spain's loss of influence and power, once the envy of Europe, became an inevitable consequence of Ferdinand's obsession with his own personal failures. The king, once celebrated as a powerful monarch, was now a relic of the past, a figurehead whose reign was defined not by his accomplishments but by his crippling personal demons. The political collapse of Spain was as much a product of Ferdinand's decline as it was a result of external pressures. His refusal to acknowledge the state of the empire and his fixation on his own dysfunction ensured that Spain would be left vulnerable to revolution and disintegration. Ferdinand had failed in every aspect of leadership. He had failed his kingdom, his people, and his dynasty. The once great empire, which had dominated much of the world, was now a hollow shell of its former self. Ferdinand's personal and political failures were now inseparable, each feeding the other. His obsession with securing an heir and his inability to face the reality of his own deformity led to the destruction of everything he had once held dear. Spain, once the most powerful empire in the world, was now in rapid decline, and its king was the man responsible for its collapse. The personal ruin of Ferdinand II was not just a tragedy for him, it was a tragedy for Spain, which would never fully recover from the scars left by his reign. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 should have marked the end of Ferdinand II's long and tragic quest for an heir. Yet, in the cruelest twist of fate, Isabella's birth would become the culmination of a lifetime spent in denial and deception. Though Ferdinand's physical and psychological decline had left him incapable of producing a legitimate heir, he refused to acknowledge the reality that Isabella was not his biological child. Instead, he clung to the delusion that she was the answer to his prayers, the fulfillment of his royal legacy. The birth of Isabella II was surrounded by secrecy and political maneuvering. Ferdinand, already deeply entrenched in his personal obsessions, refused to acknowledge that his wife, Maria Cristina, was already pregnant by another man when she arrived in Madrid. The birth of Isabella was thus not the result of Ferdinand's own bloodline, but a political necessity, one that would ensure the continuation of the Bourbon dynasty. Yet, to Ferdinand, it was a moment of triumph, a final chance to prove that he could still secure the future of his kingdom. In the years leading up to Isabella's birth, Ferdinand had already made arrangements for her ascension. His advisors, well aware of the situation, had agreed to keep the truth hidden, believing that Isabella's birth would provide a temporary solution to Spain's political crisis. The political intrigue surrounding her birth was thick with deception. Ferdinand, in his fragile mental state, never questioned the legitimacy of his daughter. He embraced the birth of Isabella as the final vindication of his reign, even as the truth gnawed at him beneath the surface. For Ferdinand, the birth of Isabella was not a victory, it was a final act of self-deception. He knew, on some level, that she was not his biological child. Yet, he clung to the idea that she was the answer to his legacy, the heir that had eluded him for so long. His refusal to confront the truth, to accept the reality of his own failure, led him to perpetuate a royal myth that would carry on for years to come. Isabella, though not his daughter by blood, was raised as his legitimate heir. Her birth was the final deception of Ferdinand's life, and it would serve as a tragic symbol of the king's inability to face the truth about himself. Ferdinand's delusions extended beyond his personal life. He became obsessed with ensuring that Isabella's reign would be seen as legitimate. His growing paranoia led him to take extreme measures to secure her position as the rightful heir. He sought out legal declarations, political alliances, and even staged events to prove that Isabella was his daughter, despite the undeniable evidence to the contrary. His obsession with her legitimacy became so consuming that it overshadowed his ability to govern. The kingdom, already on the brink of collapse, found itself trapped in a web of lies and deceptions, spun by a king who could no longer distinguish between reality and fantasy. In the years that followed Isabella's birth, Ferdinand's delusions grew stronger. He believed that Isabella was not only the heir to his throne, but also the key to the restoration of Spain's former glory. He saw her as a vessel for his unfulfilled desires, the child who could undo the failures of his reign. Yet, this delusion only deepened the rift between Ferdinand and his kingdom. His refusal to face the truth about his daughter's origins, and his relentless obsession with securing her place as the rightful heir contributed to the further unraveling of Spain's political stability. Ferdinand's last act of deception, his creation of a false royal lineage, was the culmination of a lifetime spent denying his own inadequacies. His reign had been defined by personal failure, and Isabella's birth, though meant to be a triumph, was the final, tragic chapter of a story marked by delusion and denial. Ferdinand's refusal to accept reality would haunt Spain for years to come, as the nation continued to grapple with the consequences of his reign. The birth of Isabella II was not the end of Ferdinand's story, but the beginning of a new era, a new chapter of political turmoil and intrigue that would continue long after his death. For Ferdinand, it was the final delusion, the last attempt to shape his legacy. But in truth, his reign had already crumbled under the weight of his personal and political failures. The birth of Isabella was not the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty, it was the final, heartbreaking reminder that Ferdinand had never been able to face the truth about himself or the empire he had ruined. By the time Ferdinand entered his later years, his reign had become a psychological labyrinth of control, suspicion, and surveillance. His once great kingdom, already crumbling from within, had become a mirror of his own fractured mind. Ferdinand, ever paranoid and consumed by his fears, surrounded himself with a network of spies, informants, and secretive courtiers who were tasked with monitoring every corner of his life. His obsession with surveillance, both of his wife, Maria Cristina, and his court reached levels of absurdity that would define the final years of his reign. Ferdinand's control over his palace became more oppressive with each passing day. His paranoia, which had always been a part of his personality, grew into an all-encompassing force that dictated every aspect of royal life. No one, not even the Queen herself, was exempt from his scrutiny. Maria Cristina, who had once been Ferdinand's political ally, found herself trapped in a web of surveillance and distrust. Ferdinand, unable to trust anyone, especially those closest to him, began to employ a system of spies to monitor her every move. Food tasters, once a precaution for kings concerned with poisoning, became a regular part of daily life at court. Every dish served to the royal family was tested for toxins, with Ferdinand convinced that his enemies were attempting to kill him through food. His paranoia extended to the royal servants as well, who were forced to undergo interrogations and constant monitoring. Ferdinand's need for control over every aspect of his life, including his most intimate moments with Maria Cristina, led to the installation of spy holes in their chambers, allowing him to watch his wife without her knowledge. This surveillance extended beyond the palace walls. Ferdinand's spies infiltrated the streets of Madrid, keeping watch over anyone who might dare to speak out against him or his reign. Every word spoken in the royal court, every gesture made in the palace halls, was scrutinized by Ferdinand's ever-watchful eyes. Even the smallest perceived slight was met with severe punishment. Ferdinand's need for control had transformed the palace into a prison, not only for his enemies but for his own family. Maria Cristina, once a woman of strength and conviction, found herself emotionally and physically drained by Ferdinand's constant surveillance. She became a mere shadow of her former self, trapped in a gilded cage of paranoia and distrust. The Queen's health began to deteriorate under the strain of Ferdinand's oppressive control, and the court, once a place of diplomacy and grace, became a hotbed of fear and suspicion. The very nature of royal life had been corrupted by Ferdinand's mental decline. The toll of Ferdinand's paranoia was felt by the entire court. His once loyal advisors were now subjects to his whims, forced to watch their every word and action. The once proud Spanish monarchy had been reduced to a kingdom of fear, where even the smallest perceived betrayal could lead to exile or worse. Ferdinand's obsessive need for control had turned the court into a place where trust was non-existent, and survival depended on one's ability to navigate the shifting tides of royal favor. But the psychological toll of this constant surveillance was not confined to Ferdinand's court. The kingdom at large felt the effects of his paranoia. As Spain's political situation continued to deteriorate, Ferdinand's increasingly erratic behavior alienated even his closest allies. His delusions of conspiracy spread beyond his palace, poisoning Spain's international relations and eroding the trust of foreign powers. Diplomats who had once praised Ferdinand's leadership now recoiled at his erratic behavior, and Spain found itself increasingly isolated on the world stage. Ferdinand's reign, once characterized by power and control, had devolved into a tyrannical nightmare. His need for absolute surveillance, his obsession with uncovering imagined conspiracies, and his unrelenting control over his court and family had transformed Spain into a kingdom on the brink of collapse. His paranoia had destroyed not only his relationships with those closest to him, but also the very fabric of Spain's political and diplomatic standing. As Ferdinand's paranoia intensified, it became clear that the Spanish court had descended into a state of complete dysfunction. The trust that once bound the monarch to his court had eroded, and Ferdinand's insatiable need for control had transformed the palace into a place of fear and constant surveillance. It wasn't just Ferdinand's mental state that was deteriorating, it was the very foundation of the monarchy itself. Under his rule, the court had become an institution of suspicion. Ministers, diplomats, and courtiers who had once attended to Ferdinand with respect now moved cautiously through the royal halls, aware that even the slightest misstep could lead to banishment or worse. Ferdinand's court had always been a place of power, where the nobility and the king's closest advisors played delicate games of diplomacy and influence. But now, under Ferdinand's ever-watchful eye, it had become a place of shadowy intrigue, where even the most innocent gestures were suspect. Ferdinand's spies were everywhere, infiltrating every aspect of court life. No one could be trusted, and everyone was a potential threat. The king, obsessed with the idea of conspiracies, relied on a network of informants to keep track of his courtiers. These spies, whose loyalty was more about survival than allegiance, reported even the smallest perceived slight or betrayal. The once loyal ministers found themselves increasingly isolated from the king, as Ferdinand's paranoia pushed him to trust only those who would flatter him and feed into his delusion. The psychological toll of Ferdinand's actions was felt not just by his ministers but by the entire Spanish court. The once grand palaces of Madrid had become suffocating, their halls haunted by whispers and furtive glances. Ferdinand's need for absolute loyalty had turned his court into a house of mirrors, where every courtesan, noble, and servant was forced to carefully navigate the shifting allegiances of the monarch. Courtiers, once thriving in the intricate political games of the court, now found themselves trapped in a nightmare of suspicion and fear. The lightness and elegance that had once defined Spain's royal gatherings were now replaced with anxiety and distrust. Ferdinand's increasing isolation only deepened his paranoia. He began to believe that even his closest advisors were conspiring against him. He would frequently accuse his ministers of disloyalty without cause, and his temper would flare when those who were supposed to be his allies failed to anticipate his every need. The once respected statesmen who had navigated the intricacies of European politics now found themselves trapped under the weight of Ferdinand's delusions. One by one, they were replaced by yes-men individuals who fed into Ferdinand's insatiable need for adulation, but who ultimately proved to be ineffective in their roles. Spain's political landscape, already fragile from years of misrule, became more unstable as Ferdinand's behavior alienated his allies. Foreign powers, watching the situation unfold, grew increasingly concerned. Spain, once a dominant force in Europe, was now seen as a nation on the brink of collapse, with a monarch who could neither rule effectively nor command the respect of his court. The increasing instability in Spain's domestic and foreign affairs mirrored the psychological breakdown of its king. While Ferdinand's internal collapse ravaged the royal court, Spain's external relations began to suffer. The king's erratic behavior led to deteriorating relationships with other European monarchies. Diplomats who had once sought alliances with Spain now found themselves avoiding the court, fearing the unpredictable whims of a king who had become a symbol of instability. Ferdinand's paranoia reached beyond the walls of the palace, infecting Spain's diplomacy and foreign relations. The once proud Spanish Empire was now isolated on the world stage, its royal family consumed by delusion. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Ferdinand's breakdown was the toll it took on his family. His wife, Maria Cristina, whom he had once trusted and loved, found herself increasingly isolated and trapped in a marriage that had become a psychological prison. Her attempts to manage the royal court while dealing with Ferdinand's erratic behavior left her exhausted and emotionally scarred. She began to show signs of distress, her health faltering, as she navigated the toxic dynamics of a court that had become a breeding ground for fear and mistrust. Even Ferdinand's daughter, Isabella II, was not immune to the effects of her father's dysfunction. Though she was crowned queen in 1830, her reign began under the shadow of Ferdinand's psychological collapse. Ferdinand's obsession with her legitimacy and his constant interference in her affairs left Isabella in a precarious position. Though she was the monarch, the burden of navigating a kingdom in turmoil fell heavily on her shoulders. Spain's political decay, born of her father's misrule, became the crucible through which she would have to forge her own reign. The collapse of the Spanish court under Ferdinand's rule was not just a consequence of his mental illness, it was a direct result of his refusal to acknowledge the weight of his personal failings. The dysfunction that plagued Ferdinand's rule spread like a virus, infecting not only the palace, but the very fabric of Spanish society. His obsession with power, his need for control, and his inability to face the truth about his own condition all contributed to the gradual unraveling of Spain's monarchy. What should have been a time of strength and stability became a period of extreme psychological strain, and the effects would be felt for generations. As Ferdinand's reign continued its downward spiral, Spain's position in Europe shifted from one of dominance to one of shame. The court, once a center of influence and culture, had become a tragic symbol of the dangers of unchecked power and personal dysfunction. Ferdinand's breakdown, though personal, had profound implications for the future of the Spanish Empire. Ferdinand II's final years were marked by a deepening of the personal and political chaos that had characterized much of his reign. His health continued to decline, and his once powerful body, ravaged by gout and the physical toll of his deformity, became a reflection of his mental decay. The man who had once commanded the respect of Europe now found himself isolated, both physically and emotionally, as his mind crumbled under the weight of his obsessions. The king's death in 1833 came after a prolonged period of suffering. It was anticlimactic, a slow fade rather than a dramatic end. Officially, the cause of death was listed as gout, a disease that had ravaged his joints and left him in constant pain. But those who had been closest to him knew the truth. Ferdinand had died not just from a physical ailment, but from a lifetime of psychological trauma. His mind had been consumed by his fears, insecurities, and delusions, leaving him unable to fulfill the most basic duties of a ruler. Ferdinand's final moments were spent in a state of delirium, his mind adrift between the past and the present. He drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally calling out for his lost wives, or issuing orders for investigations into plots that had never existed. The once great king, whose name had been synonymous with power, was now a ghost of his former self, physically decayed, mentally fractured, and utterly consumed by the failures of his reign. The death of Ferdinand II marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of a new set of challenges for Spain. His death left a power vacuum that would soon be filled by his daughter, Isabella II, but her reign would be forever tainted by the legacy of her father's misrule. The country, already in turmoil, was now left to grapple with the aftermath of a monarch whose personal dysfunction had left it on the brink of collapse. Ferdinand's legacy, as history would come to recognize, was not one of greatness or triumph, but one of ruin. He had ruled a once great empire, but in the end, he had failed to see beyond his own personal insecurities and had allowed them to destroy everything he had sought to protect. His reign had been defined not by power or diplomacy, but by his own obsessive need for control, his paranoia, and his inability to confront the reality of his situation. His death was not the end of his story, it was only the beginning of the consequences of his actions. His personal failings had become Spain's national tragedy, and his inability to provide for the future of the Spanish throne had left a kingdom in turmoil. Ferdinand II's legacy would forever be marked by the tragic waste of his potential, the suffering of those closest to him, and the destruction of an empire that had once been among the most powerful in the world. The death of Ferdinand II in 1833 sent shockwaves through Spain, but the immediate aftermath of his passing was filled with uncertainty. The kingdom, already in disarray, was left to pick up the pieces of a broken monarchy. Ferdinand's daughter, Isabella II, was declared queen, but her reign began under a cloud of suspicion and turmoil. The legitimacy of her rule was questioned from the moment she ascended the throne, and the country's political landscape was now irrevocably altered. Ferdinand's personal failings, his obsessive quest for an heir, and his inability to address the real issues facing Spain had left the country in a state of crisis. The empire had already been weakened by years of internal strife and external revolution, and Ferdinand's death did little to stabilize the situation. The throne, once the symbol of Spain's power and prestige, was now a symbol of weakness. Isabella, though young and inexperienced, was thrust into a role she was not prepared for, and the challenges she faced were immense. Spain's colonies, particularly in the Americas, were in the midst of revolutions that would soon lead to their independence. The loss of these territories, once the backbone of Spain's wealth and influence, left a gaping hole in the kingdom's power. Isabella's reign, though meant to restore stability, was instead marked by political instability, civil unrest, and the continued decline of Spain's imperial ambitions. Her youth and the shadow of her father's failures created a volatile atmosphere at court, where rival factions vied for control. The rise of Isabella II marked the end of Ferdinand's troubled legacy, but it was also the beginning of a new set of challenges for Spain. Her reign would be shaped by the ongoing struggle to reconcile the broken pieces of the monarchy left behind by her father's rule. Ferdinand's personal failings had poisoned Spain's political system, and Isabella's attempts to govern would be forever linked to the mistakes of her father. Despite the challenges, Isabella's reign would eventually lead to some attempts at modernization and reform. But the damage done by Ferdinand's reign was deep, and the scars left by his personal and political failures would continue to shape Spain's history for generations to come. Ferdinand II's reign, though filled with personal and political catastrophe, remains one of the most tragic and underexplored chapters in European history. His story is often overshadowed by the grandeur of other monarchs, but beneath the surface of his failure lies a deep and haunting legacy. The hidden history of Ferdinand's personal suffering, his deformed body, and his tortured psyche provides a chilling glimpse into the toll that absolute power can take on the human soul. Ferdinand's legacy is one of paradoxes, a man who held the crown of Spain but could not rule his own body. A king who sought to preserve his bloodline but failed to see the damage that his obsession was causing. His reign was a devastating reminder of how personal dysfunction can intertwine with political authority, leading to the collapse of entire nations. While Ferdinand's story is often reduced to his failures, his personal suffering, the deformity that marked him as a freak, the paranoia that consumed his reign, and the psychological toll of his actions reveals a tragic man who was both a perpetrator and a victim. His legacy is not just one of national ruin, but also one of human vulnerability. He was a man who was never able to reconcile his role as a ruler with the burden of his own shortcomings. The history of Ferdinand II also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. His reign, which could have been one of great potential, was instead marked by wasted opportunities, betrayal, and self-delusion. His tragic legacy reminds us that power without wisdom, and a ruler without the ability to face their own demons, can lead to disaster on a national scale. The suffering that Ferdinand inflicted upon his wives, his children, and his people will forever be intertwined with his name. His story, though largely forgotten by the broader historical narrative, is one of profound human tragedy, a king who was trapped not only by his physical deformity, but by the weight of his own delusions. The monarchy he left behind, though not immediately destroyed, was irreparably damaged by the man who had failed to confront his own humanity. In the end, Ferdinand II's legacy is one of haunting irony. He achieved a kind of immortality, not through great deeds, but through the enduring pain of his failures. His anatomical legacy, sealed in the Vatican's archives, remains a silent testament to the destructive power of personal shame, political dysfunction, and the fragile nature of human existence. Ferdinand's life is a reminder that behind every grand historical narrative lies the human cost, the forgotten tragedies of those who lived and suffered under the weight of power, unable to escape the legacy they left behind.